The rumble of your Allison engine is a familiar comfort, a steady heartbeat in the vast, empty sky over Assam. It's December 13th, 1943. A routine patrol. Then the horizon changes. Not a cloud, but a formation. First a dozen specks, then 24, then more. 64 enemy aircraft, bombers and fighters, a wave of steel aimed at the heart of the Allied airlift. You are alone. One P-40 Warhawk against an armada. The choice isn't between victory or defeat. It's between survival and duty. You push the throttle forward. This is the China-Burma-India Theater, the forgotten front of the Second World War. While headlines screamed of Stalingrad and Guadalcanal, here, in the shadow of the Himalayas, a different kind of war was being fought. It was a war against not just a determined enemy, but against the terrain itself. A relentless battle against monsoon rains, impenetrable jungles, and logistical chains stretched to the breaking point. The strategic linchpin of this entire theater was an operation of breathtaking audacity known as the Hump. Allied pilots flew unarmed C-47 transport planes over the highest mountain range on Earth, a treacherous sky road of unpredictable winds and zero visibility, to deliver vital supplies to the beleaguered nationalist Chinese armies. If this lifeline were severed, China could fall, potentially releasing over 1 million Japanese soldiers to fight elsewhere. The airfields in the Assam Valley, like Dinjan, were the arteries of this operation. They were more than just runways. They were the fulcrum upon which the fate of Asia rested. Patrolling these skies was the 89th Fighter Squadron, and among its pilots was 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair. Adair was not a household name, not a famed ace with a long tally of victories. He was a young American, one of thousands, sent to the farthest corners of the globe to do an impossible job. His mount was the Curtis P-40 Warhawk, a fighter plane that by late 1943 was already showing its age. Outclassed by the newer Mustangs and Thunderbolts dominating the skies over Europe, the P-40 was a relic. But here, in the CBI, it was a legend. It was tough, heavily armed, and could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment. Its liquid-cooled Allison WWII 1710 engine gave it superb performance at low altitudes and, most critically, a blistering speed in a dive. The Warhawk was a brawler, a stubborn and reliable workhorse for a theater that demanded nothing less. Adair's personal machine was named Lulu Bell. On this particular day, he wasn't looking for a fight. His mission was a simple weather reconnaissance flight. But the war had other plans. The specks on the horizon resolved into the unmistakable shapes of enemy aircraft. A massive, disciplined formation of Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers, known to the Allies as the Sally, flanked by their deadly escorts, the nimble Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. 64-1. The target was obvious. Dinjan Airfield, the very heart of the Hump operations. Adair's radio crackled to life with his own frantic report, but he knew the truth. No help could possibly scramble and climb to intercept in time. The bombers were mere minutes from their release point. He watched the enemy armada fly on, a perfectly oiled machine of destruction. Below him on the ground were the C-47s, the fuel dumps, the munitions stores, the entire Allied effort in microcosm. In that moment, a cold clarity descended upon him. The manual, the training, his own instinct for self-preservation, all screamed for him to escape. But duty whispered something else. His mission was no longer about observation. It was about intervention. He had to break that formation. He had to disrupt their aim. He had to become a wrench thrown into the gears of the Japanese war machine, even if it shattered him in the process. With a final check of his 6 machine guns, Philip Adair pointed the nose of Lulu Bell down and firewalled the throttle. The P-40 was a magnificent diver. Unlike the lightweight Japanese Oscars, which were designed for agile, close-quarters combat, the American Warhawk was a heavyweight. It had mass, and gravity was its greatest ally. As Adair plunged towards the bomber formation, his airspeed indicator wound past 400 miles per hour. He centered his sight on the lead bomber of the foremost element, the linchpin holding the entire structure together. His thumbs depressed the triggers. 6 50-caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, erupted in a deafening roar that vibrated through the entire airframe. For a fraction of a second, Lulu Bell became a fire-breathing shotgun, spewing a torrent of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds into the heart of the Japanese armada. Tracers reached out like fiery fingers, stitching lines across the wings and fuselage of the lead sallies. He saw flashes of impacts, chunks of aluminum tearing away, but he didn't linger to observe the results. The cardinal rule of this type of engagement, what pilots called boom and zoom tactics, was to never, ever slow down. He ripped through the formation like a cannonball through a flock of geese, the closing speed so immense that the Japanese gunners barely had time to track him. In his wake, the perfect geometric precision of the raid dissolved. Bombers peeled away from the core, their pilots instinctively reacting to the sudden, savage attack from nowhere. The disciplined grid of defensive fire was now a panicked, disorganized spray. But the threat was far from over. The Oscar fighter escorts, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the lone attacker, now reacted with lethal purpose. They broke from their escort positions, their lighter airframes allowing them to turn on a dime, and converge on Adair's position. He was now the sole focus of their fury. Adair knew he could never outturn an Oscar. To engage them in a traditional dogfight would be suicide. He kept his nose down, using the tremendous energy built up in his dive to extend away, putting distance between himself and his pursuers. The Oscars, fast as they were, simply couldn't keep up with the P-40 in a sustained dive. He leveled out just above the treetops, the jungle canopy a green smear beneath his wings, before pulling Lulu Bell back up into a steep climbing turn. His eyes scanned the sky, locating the scattered remnants of the bomber formation. They were trying to regroup, to salvage their mission. Adair would not allow it. He climbed back to altitude, positioning himself with the sun at his back, a classic fighter pilot's maneuver to blind his opponents. Then he did it again. He nosed over, the Allison engine screaming its protest, and plunged back into the fray. This second pass was even more ferocious. The Japanese were expecting him now, and the air was thick with defensive fire, but their cohesion was gone. They were no longer a unified strike force, but a collection of individual aircraft trying to both defend themselves and find their target. Adair's guns hammered away once more, this time targeting a different section of the scattered group. The psychological impact was immense. The raid was compromised. The element of surprise was lost. From the perspective of the Japanese commander, this single, seemingly invincible fighter was a ghost, appearing from nowhere, striking with devastating effect, and then vanishing before his escorts could pin it down. The risk of pressing the attack on Dinjan against such unpredictable and ferocious resistance was now too great. The order was given. The remaining Sally bombers jettisoned their payloads harmlessly over the jungle and turned for home. The mission was a success. The airfield was safe. But for Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, the battle had just begun. He was still deep in enemy territory, and now the hunters had only one prey. As Adair pulled out of his second dive, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over him. The sky ahead was clearing as the Ki-21 bombers turned tail. He had done it. He had saved the airfield. But the feeling was fleeting, replaced by the cold reality of his own predicament. The Oscars were now on him like a pack of wolves. He could see them in his rearview mirror, their radial engines, glinting in the sun, closing the distance with alarming speed. He had won the strategic battle, but now faced a personal one for survival. He firewalled the throttle again, pushing the aging Allison engine to its absolute limit, trying to outrun the swarm. But the adrenaline of his attack dives had cost him precious energy and altitude. He was now on the defensive, jinking and weaving, trying to make himself the most difficult target possible. The air around his cockpit erupted with the concussive impacts of cannon shells and machine gun fire. He heard the sickening thud of rounds punching through Lulu Bell's aluminum skin, a sound like a blacksmith hammering on an anvil just behind his head. The canopy suddenly crazed over as a stray round struck the armored glass, spiderwebbing his view of the world. A sharp, violent jolt shook the entire aircraft as a cannon shell found its mark in his right wing, blowing a ragged hole and severing something vital. The P-40 shuddered, its controls suddenly feeling loose and unresponsive in his hands. A warning light flashed on his instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping. It was a pilot's nightmare. The lifeblood of his engine was bleeding out into the sky. He could smell it now, the acrid, unmistakable scent of burning oil and glycol coolant. A thin wisp of smoke began to curl from the engine cowling, a death shroud for his faithful Allison. He knew he had only minutes before the engine would seize completely, transforming his fighter plane into a 2-ton glider. His priority shifted from evasion to escape. He had to get back to friendly territory. He pushed the stick forward, diving for the relative safety of the jungle canopy once more, hoping to use the terrain to mask his retreat. The Oscars followed relentlessly. They had tasted blood. They knew he was wounded, and they were not going to let him go. More rounds hammered into his fuselage. He felt a sharp pain in his leg, but there was no time to assess the wound. The stick in his hand suddenly went slack. He moved it left and right, but the plane responded sluggishly, then not at all. A look of horror dawned on his face as he realized what had happened. The control cables to his ailerons, the surfaces on the wings that allowed him to bank and turn, had been severed. Lulu Bell was mortally wounded. The plane, no longer under his complete control, began a slow, terrifying roll to the left. Adair fought it with the rudder, kicking his feet against the pedals with all his might, but it was a losing battle. The aircraft's inherent instability, exacerbated by the hole in the wing, was taking over. The roll steepened, the nose dropped, and Lulu Bell began to spiral towards the jungle in a terminal dive. The ground rushed up to meet him. This was it. This was how it ended. Trapped in a crippled machine, spiraling into a green abyss thousands of miles from home. He gripped the controls, his knuckles white, every fiber of his being straining against the inevitable. There was no way to pull out. Without ailerons, he couldn't level the wings, and without level wings, pulling back on the stick would only tighten the deadly spiral. The roar of the wind became a deafening scream. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat. Through the crazed canopy, the world was a spinning vortex of green and brown. Then a spark of desperate, counterintuitive genius flickered in his mind. An idea so insane, so contrary to every rule of flight, that it just might work. He had no control in an upright position. But what about upside down? Instinct and training screamed against the idea. An aircraft is meant to fly right side up. Its wings are designed to generate lift in that orientation. Flying inverted was a temporary, acrobatic maneuver, not a sustainable method of flight. But Philip Adair was out of conventional options. His aircraft was no longer an airplane in the traditional sense. It was a falling object with an engine still for the moment, providing thrust. With the ground just a few thousand feet away, he made his choice. Instead of fighting the roll, he pushed the stick forward and to the left, using what little response he had to help the plane continue its roll onto its back. For a dizzying moment, the world flipped. The green jungle canopy was now his sky, and the blue sky his ground. He was hanging from his seat straps, loose items in the cockpit floating around him. In this inverted position, the fundamental physics of flight changed. The force of gravity, which had been pulling his nose down in the spiral, was now pulling the entire aircraft upwards relative to his inverted orientation. He cautiously pulled back on the control column. To his utter astonishment, the P-40 responded. The nose, which had been pointing straight at the jungle floor, began to rise toward the horizon. The deadly dive had been arrested. He was flying. He was actually flying, upside down. The discovery was a revelation, a sudden flash of insight in the midst of chaos. He realized that with his aileron controls gone, the rudder pedals now had a reversed and exaggerated effect. Pushing the left rudder pedal, which would normally swing the aircraft's nose to the left, now caused the inverted plane to bank upwards to the right. He had found a crude, clumsy, but functional way to steer his crippled machine. He was no longer a passenger on a plummeting aircraft. He was a pilot again. The Oscars, seeing him enter what they must have assumed was an uncontrollable death spiral, had broken off their attack, confident their work was done. He was, for the moment, alone. But his problems were far from over. The engine, starved of oil, was beginning to sound rougher, its powerful rhythm turning into a sporadic, metallic cough. The smoke trailing from the cowling was thicker now, and he couldn't fly upside down forever. The human body isn't designed for it. And more importantly, neither was the P-40's fuel system. He knew he had to regain an upright position, but every attempt to roll the plane back over sent it lurching back into another uncontrolled dive. He was trapped in a bizarre, inverted reality. He could climb, he could turn, but he could not fly straight and level in the normal way. So he developed a new, desperate technique. He would fly inverted, pulling back on the stick to gain as much altitude as the dying engine would give him. Then, as the plane neared the peak of its climb and its airspeed bled off, he would kick the rudder hard, forcing the P-40 to flop over into a right-side-up orientation. For a few precious seconds, he would be flying normally, before the aircraft's damage would inevitably take over and pull it back into another dive. He would let it fall, building up speed, before rolling inverted once more to pull out of the dive and begin the cycle all over again. It was a terrifying, gut-wrenching aerial roller coaster, a repeating sequence of climbing inverted, flopping upright, diving, and then rolling inverted to recover. Each cycle was a gamble, a battle against gravity and catastrophic mechanical failure. This was how he would fly home, not in a straight line, but in a series of gigantic, parabolic lunges across the sky, a wounded bird fighting its way back to the nest, one agonizing flap at a time. His new destination was not his home base of Dinjan, but the emergency strip at Nagaguli, which was closer. Every foot of altitude he gained was a deposit in his bank of survival, to be spent on the next inevitable plunge towards the earth. The journey back to Nagaguli was a masterclass in desperation and endurance. Each parabolic arc across the sky was a monumental physical and mental effort. In the inverted climbs, blood rushed to his head, his vision tunneling, the pressure in his sinuses becoming almost unbearable. He hung from his harness, fighting the disorientation, his entire world turned upside down. Then came the violent transition, the sickening lurch as he kicked the rudder, and the P-40 flopped clumsily upright, only to immediately plunge toward the earth again. The G-forces of the subsequent pullout, even while inverted, slammed him back into his seat. It was a brutal, punishing rhythm. Climb, flop, dive, recover, over and over again. All the while, his machine was dying around him. The instruments on his panel, shattered and shaking, told a story of catastrophic failure. The oil pressure gauge had long since flatlined at 0. The engine temperature was pegged deep in the red. The Allison engine, a marvel of engineering that had propelled him into battle, was now in its death throes. Its steady roar had been replaced by a chorus of bangs, pops, and groans, a mechanical symphony of self-destruction. The smoke pouring from the cowling was no longer a wisp, but a thick black plume, a funeral pyre trailing in his wake. He could feel the engine's power fading with each climb, each cycle buying him less altitude, less time. The plane itself felt heavy and unresponsive, a mortally wounded beast that was barely obeying his bizarre commands. The controls were a mess. His elevators, which controlled the plane's pitch, were also damaged. He discovered that in order to climb while inverted, he had to push the stick forward, another counterintuitive act that went against every instinct. Pulling back caused the nose to drop. It was a confusing, reversed control scheme that required constant, intense concentration to manage. Any lapse, any moment of reversion to his ingrained training would be fatal. He flew not with the fluid grace of a pilot, but with the grim determination of a man wrestling a demon. Through the cracked and crazed canopy, he finally spotted it. The thin brown gash of the runway at Nagaguli Airfield. It was a sight as beautiful as any he had ever seen, a promise of sanctuary. But it was still miles away. He nursed the last ounces of power from the failing engine, performing 2 more of his agonizing parabolic leaps to cover the remaining distance. He was on his final approach, lining up with the runway as best he could from his inverted perspective. He could see the ground crew, small figures pointing up at the sky, no doubt staring in disbelief at the sight of a P-40 flying upside down, trailing a thick banner of smoke. He was almost there. Just a few hundred feet of altitude, a few more seconds of flight. Then, with a final shuddering cough and a spray of oil across his windscreen, the Allison V-1710 engine seized. The propeller jerked to a halt, and an eerie, terrifying silence descended, broken only by the shriek of the wind over his broken airframe. He was now a glider, an aerodynamically unstable, 2-ton glider with no ailerons, damaged elevators, and an inverted pilot. The most dangerous part of his ordeal, the landing, was still to come. He had no power to go around for another attempt. He had one chance, and one chance only, to get this right. He had to bring Lulubelle back to Earth, but the laws of physics and the design of his aircraft had one final, cruel trick to play. Landing gear is designed to extend downwards into the empty space below a right-side-up aircraft. From his inverted position, trying to lower the gear would mean sending it straight up into his own wings. He would have to land on his belly. But first, he had to get right side up. In the sudden silence of a dead engine, A pilot's senses sharpen. The world slows down. Every second stretches into an eternity. For Philip Adair, hanging upside down in his harness, the runway at WWII wasn't just a strip of dirt. It was the finish line of the most harrowing race of his life. He was now committed. There was no more power, no more altitude to gain, only a finite supply of kinetic energy to be managed with surgical precision. His unique, self-taught method of flying had gotten him this far, but it was designed for a powered aircraft. Now, in a powerless glide, every maneuver cost him precious altitude he could not regain. He continued his approach inverted. It felt more stable this way, the only method of control he could truly rely on. He was using his remaining airspeed to extend his glide, stretching it as far as possible to ensure he reached the threshold of the runway. He was too low, far too low to attempt one of his violent, rudder-flopping maneuvers to get upright. Any such aggressive action would bleed off too much speed and cause him to stall, to simply drop out of the sky. He needed a different solution, a final act of airmanship that was as audacious as everything that had come before it. He held the inverted glide until the last possible moment, until the trees at the end of the runway seemed close enough to touch. The ground crew, who had been watching in stunned silence, now scattered, convinced they were about to witness a catastrophic crash. At an altitude of just a few hundred feet, Adair knew it was now or never. He took a deep breath and committed to the final maneuver. With a firm, deliberate motion, he pushed the control stick forward and to the side. With no engine thrust and failing controls, he was using the last dregs of aerodynamic force and pure momentum. Lulu Bell, ever the stubborn fighter, responded one last time. The plane began a slow, deliberate roll. For a heart-stopping moment, the aircraft was flying on its side, one wing pointing to the sky, the other at the ground, a position of extreme instability. Then it continued over, completing the half-roll just as the ground rushed up to meet it. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and he would slip back into an uncontrolled dive. Too late, and he would hit the ground upside down. He leveled the wings just as the main gear should have been touching down. But of course, there was no gear. The belly of the P-40 slammed into the dirt runway with a deafening screech of tortured metal. The impact was violent, throwing Adair forward against his straps with brutal force. The crippled aircraft slid across the ground for hundreds of feet, shedding parts, its wings digging into the earth, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. It slewed sideways in a shower of sparks before finally, mercifully, grinding to a halt. The silence that followed was profound. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then the canopy was pushed open, and a figure, covered in grime and hydraulic fluid, painfully pulled himself out of the mangled cockpit and dropped to the ground. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was home. He had not only survived an encounter against 64-1 odds, but he had flown a plane that was, by all technical definitions, unflyable. He had brought back the machine that had saved him, crash-landing it on a friendly field rather than abandoning it over the jungle. The ground crews and pilots who rushed to the wreckage looked at the P-40 in disbelief. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes. One wing had a gaping cannon wound. The control surfaces were shredded, and most telling of all, the control cables for the ailerons were not just damaged, they were completely severed, swinging freely in the wind. What they were looking at was a mechanical impossibility. According to the laws of aerodynamics and the principles of aircraft design, this plane should never have made it back. It was a testament not to the machine, but to the man who had refused to let it die. The story of Philip Adair's flight quickly became the stuff of legend in the China-Burma-India Theater. It was a On January 8, 1944, less than a month after his ordeal, Second Lieutenant Adair stood before his comrades as the citation for the Silver Star was read aloud. The award, the United States' third highest personal decoration for valor in combat, was for his gallantry in action against an armed enemy of the United States. But the medal only told part of the story. It recognized his courage in attacking the 64-plane raid, a feat of bravery in its own right. Yet what truly set his accomplishment apart was the intellectual courage, the sheer ingenuity he displayed in the aftermath. He had not just fought his plane, he had reasoned with it. When the machine failed, he had diagnosed the problem in the heat of battle and improvised a solution that defied the training manuals. He had transformed his crippled fighter from a death trap into a tool of survival through sheer force of will and a profound, intuitive understanding of the physics of flight. The engagement itself was a tactical masterpiece of disruption. By prioritizing the bomber formation and using the P-40's superior diving speed, he single-handedly thwarted a major enemy operation. The Japanese had committed a massive force to a critical objective and had returned to their base with nothing to show for it but damaged aircraft and shattered confidence. It demonstrates that individual skill, situational awareness, and the ability to think under unimaginable pressure can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. It was a victory not just of American steel over Japanese ambition, but of one man's mind over the unforgiving laws of mechanics and gravity. Philip Adair was not an ace in the traditional sense. He did not add to a tally of downed enemy aircraft that day. His victory was measured differently. It was measured in the C-47 transport planes that were safe on the ground, in the tons of cargo that would successfully make the flight over the Himalayas, and in the simple, undeniable fact that he had returned from a place where no one had a right to survive. His war would continue, as would the grueling campaign in the CBI. But on that one day in December, a lone pilot in an aging Warhawk, faced with impossible odds, didn't just fight a battle. He rewrote the rules of what was possible.